We're extremely well suited to eating a diet that is based on animal source foods. You better believe it. That we have a hydrochloric acid based digestive system. Okay, we don't have a bacterially based digestive system, as most herbivores do. And in fact, one thing that's interesting, until relatively recently, it was thought that most of our primate ancestors were largely vegetarian. We know now that the research is very clear that virtually all of them ate a significant amount of meat. Not as much as we tend to, but they all, Jane Goodall's research, we thought chimps were plant-based, had a plant-based diet until she sat there and watched them killing and eating other monkeys and other small animals on a regular basis. And so we understand, and there's a wonderful book by Craig Stanford called The Hunting Apes. You can go in and read, and it's just right down to pygmy marmosets that eat mostly, actually they eat mostly animals, you know, these tiny little primates. The exception are the mountain gorillas, but even they eat a significant number of insects along the way. So there are no vegan either primate ancestors or hominin ancestors. From at least just over 2 million years ago, we human beings or evolving hominins were basically operating in a state of what is called persistent carnivory. In other words, we had a hunting-based economy. Meat was not an occasional thing. Meat was a foundational thing from that point forward. So we're designed for that. Nothing is more stabilizing to the brain than natural dietary fat. It is very even burning, and it burns a very long time. That is the fuel for survival. And we can rely on it. If the food is scarce, we've got to supply of fuel. Sugar, on the other hand, if you're dependent on it, you've got to manage that. You've got to eat it, and then you've got to, deal with the consequences of it going too low, and then you have some more, and it goes this, and so go your moods, so goes your neurological and cognitive functioning. It's no way to live. I mean, you can manage that if you want. I'd rather not be a slave to that. It tends to be taught in medicine, of course, and if you go to take a course, conventional course in nutrition and everything else, is that, well, your brain has to have glucose, it has to have glucose, and everything has to have glucose in order to run. Well, as with many things, there is a conditional truth to that. It's true if and only if you have metabolically adapted yourself to depending on glucose as your primary source of fuel. But that's not the only option. And in fact, it's not the most natural option. It's not really the way we were designed, and in fact, I don't think nature would have ever been so stupid as to make us dependent on something so volatile and damaging as something like sugar. Take a look at the role of dietary fat in primitive cultures. All primitive and traditional cultures revered and coveted sources of dietary fat. The Plains and Northern Indians used pemmican, over which entire wars were fought. But you don't have to fight wars at all. You can go right over U.S. wellness meats. They've got great pemmican. Canadian tribes relished moose fat. Coastal Salish tribes used something called ulican grease, which is really similar, actually, in its fatty acid composition to human body fat. Very interesting. The Inuit eat and also ate large amounts of seal, walrus, and whale fat. The Inus of northern Canada coveted caribou fat. Aborigines sought out emu fat. The Maasai consume, of course, lots of high-fat raw milk. And according to the work of nutritional pioneers such as Weston Price, mental illness was virtually unknown in these cultures. So, and let's not forget, we are Ice Age beings. Fat to us means survival. And I think hence the central role that leptin plays, leptin being fundamentally a fat sensor. It's all about survival. And if you don't have what it takes to survive, then everything else is secondary to that.
The history of the Sami goes back to the remote past. Their ancestors were known to ancient Greek and Roman authors. The mention of them can be found in the historical works of Pythias in 325 BC. The Middle Age Vikings called these people Lops, giving rise to a word, Laplandia, the land of Lops. It encompassed all the lands where the Sami lived. 4,000 years ago, the glacier retreated and the Karelian Isthmus appeared, over which Samoyedian tribes traveled to Scandinavia and the Kola Peninsula from the Urals, and the European tribes came from the other side. As a result of this merger, Proto-Sami appeared. The old Sami people lived on a big territory bordering the Ladoga Lake on the south. Over time, their habitat reduced, and now it covers the area from northern Norway and Sweden over the northern regions of Finland to the Kola Peninsula. In our country, the Sami live in the Murmansk region. The village of Nervoussystem is considered to be the center of their cultural life. According to the census of 2010, there are 1,771 Sami in Russia. This Sami family has no interest whatsoever in our research or historic subtleties. In a week's time, Uliana is going to a very important event. She has long dreamt of visiting the sacred and legendary Lake Sedozera. For various reasons, she never managed to visit this iconic place. And finally, the opportunity has arrived.
I heard a lot about Lake Sedozera, and I always wanted to visit it to ask the spirits for health for the people I love.
The spirits of our ancestors live there, the Saids.
That is why it's called Sedozera, the Lake of the Spirits. Our spirits live in the water, on the ground, in the forest, up in the mountains, and in the rocks. In a word, in nature, and we believe in them.
There is still a lot to do before the departure. Today, the Yulins are having their relatives over at their place, and Uliana is preparing a treat for them.
I will cook a soup now, the way our grandparents and parents did. Of course, we need meat for it. Before, mostly meat, fish, mushrooms, and berries. They didn't have the vegetables we eat now, like tomatoes and cucumbers. They were self-sustaining. The food was simple. They also made their own bread. Living in a forest like we do now, you have to make your own bread.
Traditionally, the kitchen has always been a woman's domain. Although generally there was no strict distinction of duties between men and women. Each family member could do everything. And Boris Yulin lived 30 kilometers outside of the Nervoussystem village, right in the middle of the tundra. A few years ago, after retiring, they built a house here, erected a kuvaksa, a reindeer high tent in Sami, started to breed reindeer, and to follow the traditions of their people.
Boris's parents and my parents worked on the tundra, as well as our grandfathers and grandmothers.
Great-grandparents.
That's right, from generation to generation. I guess we are...
The last of the Mohicans. We spent all our life in the tundra, with the reindeer. When I go to Murmansk, I get a headache in half an hour. I can't stay there for too long.
We essentially grew up on the tundra, spent our childhood here. Later on, when working and taking vacations, I never went to the sea, for example. I only saw it on TV, to be honest, but I never felt a need to go to the sea. I always spent my holidays at my mother's place on the tundra.
Nowadays, the Sami rarely choose this way of living. The events of the first half of the 20th century, forced collectivization, and the rapid industrial development of the Kola Peninsula were a big upheaval for these people. The authorities appropriated their reindeer, then moved them from places where they used to live to Lavozera village. As a result, the Aboriginals stopped doing their traditional crafts. Their culture and way of life came close to extinction.
Refined foods, particularly carbohydrates, destabilize brain chemistry. And that's through this invisible internal hormonal roller coaster. So when the average person, probably not in this room, eats sugary meals 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day with flour, sugar, cereals, juice, etc. And so they get a nice big glucose spike and they get a nice insulin spike on its tail, and that brings the blood sugar back down. And so what's the problem? The problem is that insulin is not just a blood sugar regulator. Insulin is a powerful master hormone of growth that regulates lots of other hormones in the body, including the sex hormones and the stress hormones. So what you get is as the blood sugar is coming down, if it's coming down too quickly, the body will perceive that as an emergency and release stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And these are your fight or flight hormones, particularly adrenaline. And some people are quite sensitive to this, to the release of these hormones and can experience very uncomfortable symptoms, in between meals. Panic attacks, insomnia if it happens in the middle of the night, intense cravings for carbohydrates, irritability, all kinds of things. So is it any wonder that these conditions are on the rise around the world if most people are eating this way now? And if you're wondering, what's the degree of this problem, just take a look at what happens to teenage boys who drink sugar-sweetened beverages compared to a sugar-free cola drink. That's their adrenaline level spiking to nearly 5 times its baseline about 4 or 5 hours later. So this is not subtle. And for most people, this is happening, again, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. And given what we understand about how refined carbohydrates affect metabolism, my money is on the sugarlessness. We don't yet have, to the best of my knowledge, any randomized controlled trials comparing a whole foods plant-based diet to a whole foods animal-based diet. That would be a fair fight, and I'd be very interested to see what that would show. So simply removing animal foods from the diet is an untested intervention. But what about mental health? Do we have any studies of mental health and plant-based diets? Well, we have a few epidemiological studies. They're weak, they're mixed, they're poorly conducted. They often don't control for refined carbohydrates. That's just a problem that keeps happening. And there aren't any meaningful clinical trials. So we don't really have a lot to go on in that regard. But I would argue that we don't need more studies because we already know so much about what the brain needs. We know what it's made of. We know how it operates. We've been studying it for a long time. We don't know everything about it, of course, but we know what it's made of. So one of the mistakes that keeps happening in nutritional research is that researchers will choose their pet diet and then test it out on people with various conditions and see what happens. And they're always comparing whatever their pet diet is to the sad Western diet. And of course, it's always going to do better. And then they can say that their diet is great. I don't think we need any more studies in order to make scientifically sound recommendations about brain food. So when you study it that way, when you pick your diet and apply it, you're studying nutrition from the outside in. I prefer to study it from the inside out. What does the brain need? How do we get it there? So, when I was in psychiatry residency, 4 years of psychiatry residency after medical school, not a word about diet in 4 years, of course, I left with the impression that the brain was just a bag of neurotransmitters designed to be manipulated with medications. And, and I did that for a while until I became interested in nutrition. But of course, the brain is so much more than that. It's this beautiful, sophisticated electrical organ lined with these special fats, and it's just amazing. And billions and billions of beautiful cells, and if everything isn't constructed properly, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter how many drugs you throw at it or how well your neurotransmitters are working. So, what is the brain made of? Let's start there. So, the brain is 2/3 fat. And a full 20% of that is this amazing essential omega-3 fatty acid called DHA. The brain has a lot of protein in it. Of course, every organ needs protein to build essential components. neurotransmitters and the like. The brain is loaded with cholesterol. 20% of your body's cholesterol is housed in the brain, and that despite the fact that the brain only represents 2% of your body weight. And the brain, again, an energy hog, needs a constant supply of glucose and ketones to keep it running. And in order to extract energy from those molecules, it needs lots of vitamins and minerals to run those chemical reactions. I'd like to introduce you a little bit more to DHA. So DHA is a really incredible molecule. It's been conserved over evolution for more than 500 million years in vertebrates. So vertebrates have used it as is for that length of time, and you'll find it enriched in all of these special places in the body, from mitochondrial membranes to synapses and even to the photoreceptor in the retina. It's responsible for helping to maintain the integrity of the blood-brain barrier as well. So interestingly, DHA is really critical for the proper development of the frontal cortex in humans, and if that doesn't go well, problems can ensue. So what is so special about this molecule? Well, it turns out that the configuration of it has quantum mechanical properties, and that just means that and I'm not a physicist, but my understanding is that it interacts with electrons in a very special way, in a couple of important ways. One is, as in the retina, in the photoreceptor, it can actually transform sunlight into electricity. And in synapses and other places in the body, it actually functions as a semiconductor, buffering electron flow. It's really quite amazing. So people much smarter than I am have hypothesized that without DHA, consciousness, symbolic thinking, intelligence, impossible. And according to this researcher, DHA plays a unique and indispensable role in the neural signaling essential for higher intelligence. So here's the rub. Plant foods contain absolutely no DHA whatsoever. They contain ALA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid, but it is widely agreed that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to transform ALA from plant foods in the body into the DHA that the brain needs. This may help to explain why vegetarians and vegans have lower DHA levels than omnivores. Another powerful argument for including animal foods in the diet if you care about your brain is the micronutrient access argument. So here are some nutrients of interest. Actually, every single nutrient that the body needs can be found in animal foods, and what's more, in the most highly bioavailable form possible. Compare that to plant foods, which not only are lacking certain key nutrients, such as B12, vitamin K2, EPA, and DHA, but some of the forms of nutrients that they contain are harder for us to use, iron, for example. So to make matters even worse, plants also contain something animal foods do not contain, anti-nutrients. So anti-nutrients are chemicals, natural chemicals in plants that are there for their own purposes. But many of them interfere with our ability to utilize nutrients, not only from the plant foods that we eat, but from the animal foods that we eat along with those plant foods. And I want to call your attention to a couple of them. Soy, which is an important staple protein food for people who choose a plant-based diet, interferes with iodine utilization, and that can impact thyroid function. And thyroid function is very important for the brain. And then the grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, which are really important, crucial elements of a plant-based diet because they do contain protein. They are rich in phytic acid, and phytic acid is a mineral magnet that interferes with minerals like iron, zinc, calcium, and magnesium. So why is this important? It's important because, again, remember, the brain needs more nutrients than many other parts of the body because of its activity. And these nutrients are really key to brain function. If you are deficient in these, your brain may not be working at top speed. So how bad is this phytic acid problem? Here's an example. If you eat zinc-rich oysters with black beans, you will absorb less than half of the zinc from those oysters. If you eat those same oysters with corn tortillas, you absorb virtually none of the zinc from the oysters. So it's literally robbing your brain of these minerals. And this may help to explain why vegans are more likely to be inadequate in zinc than omnivores. Note that omnivores are also at risk because they do eat some of these seed foods. Iron deficiency is rampant. People think of iron deficiency, in women in particular, people think of iron deficiency as a blood problem. But iron deficiency, if you have iron deficiency, you also have a brain problem. So it's another reason why I think that meat belongs in a healthy brain healthy diet. But it doesn't have to be red meat. By meat, I mean animal foods. It can be the meat of any animal. So for example, duck is richer in iron than red meat, and oysters even more so. And when it comes to iron and B12, oysters are a powerhouse. And if you're looking for, liver is as well, it's less palatable to many people. But if you're looking for DHA, really seafood is where it's at. And if you look at this chart, salmon is included there, and it just kind of blows everybody else out of the water. So the people that I'm most concerned about when it comes to low meat or plant-based diet in terms of accessing critical brain nutrients are women. So because women are more likely to be culturally averse to eating meat and fat. That may help to explain why 3/4 of vegans are female in the United States. They're more likely to prioritize weight and appearance over health. They're more likely to prioritize animal and planet health over their own personal health for compassionate reasons. And this is not just a problem for the women that we care about in our lives, it is also a problem for the future generations because women literally feed the brains, build the brains of the next generation through their food choices. So what happens if you don't get enough DHA early in life? These are, again, just associations. We can't be sure. But children with autism are more likely to have lower levels of DHA, for example. And omega-3 supplementation doesn't seem to help very much. The critical window for obtaining DHA in young life is the 3rd trimester to age 2. Once that window closes, we may not be able to undo a lot of that damage. With ADHD, we know that children are more likely to be obese or overweight, twice as likely than their age-matched counterparts, but we don't know if there's a cause and effect relationship there. But we do know that they tend to be deficient in omega-3s, particularly DHA, EPA, and zinc and iron. Again, zinc and iron are much easier to get from animal foods than from plant foods. There's been some very interesting elimination diet studies with ADHD, putting children on what looks mostly like a whole foods diet. They threw in some margarine and some apple juice too, but just a few foods diet, and a little misguided. But these studies show remarkable results. They're flawed studies, but there are quite a few of them, and they all point in the same direction. And so why not try that? What would be the harm? So which diet do I think offers the most hope for humanity? I advocate for a pre-agricultural whole foods diet. Why? Because it contains animal foods which are rich in nutrients, so it maximizes your nutrient availability, and it's lower in anti-nutrients than a post-agricultural whole foods diet, which, like the Mediterranean diet, which will be contain a lot of grains and legumes, and the phytic acid and so forth. So I think it's an excellent diet, and it makes sense, right? I mean, why should this be a radical suggestion? I mean, I can't understand why people think this is such a strange idea.
The way I look at the brain from that perspective is being fundamentally bioelectric. And, all bioelectric so the brain is, in other words, it's more than just simply a hodgepodge of psychological constructs, as one would come to from this perspective, maybe a psychologist or whatever. And it's more than just simply a vessel of chemical soup. But the brain is also bioelectric. And all biochemical reactions in the body and brain are essentially preceded by an electrical depolarization of the cell. And that electrical depolarization of the cell is intimately dependent upon certain timing mechanisms. And those timing mechanisms are largely generated by a part of the brain called the thalamus. And the thalamus, it just so happens to be what we're more or less directly appealing to with this process. And so so in helping the brain regulate a little bit better its bioelectric processes, we come to a place of helping the brain manage its own states a great deal better. It also streamlines a great deal with respect to some of the biochemical things, as long as the brain has what it needs. And, that brings us to some other things. But we look upon many brain-based issues as basically being related to dysregulated timing mechanisms and also phase relationships that are largely due to stressors on some level, whether the stressors are physical, psychological, emotional, or physiological. Stress is stress and can impact the brain in a very similar manner. So rather than compartmentalizing the brain in the way we look at it, we recognize each dysregulation. Nobody ever comes in with one thing. People walk in and they say, yeah, I'm depressed. Also, I have trouble sleeping. And by the way, I get migraines a lot. And by the way, I'm kind of anxious and I don't pay attention very well. Well, that's a half dozen things. And if you were to go to an MD or you go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or something, you would basically be looking at a half dozen different disorders for which you would maybe receive a half dozen different prescriptions. Instead, the way I look upon these things as all being each part of a larger constellation or spectrum related to dysregulated arousal. So the bottom line is, though, that the best psychotherapy, brain training, or any medication, whatever it is you've got, can't put a nutrient there that's not there. Can't take away some offending substance that doesn't belong there. The brain and the body need certain raw materials in order to function, period. And so what I find is that, I see what I get with neurofeedback, and then we see what's left over. And when people are open to it, then we start talking turkey with all this stuff. So the bottom line is that it's really no fun being a prisoner in your own nervous system, and that's what I see every day. I see people basically at the mercy of, like, their brain is like a horse riding around with no reins. And this is exactly what I deal with. It's lots of fun. So stress, of course, being the big culprit here. Welcome to the modern world. It's a good thing, I think, to define stress and understand really what it is. Well, stress is not necessarily what happens to us. It is how we respond to what happens to us. And of course, it's mitigated by a part of the brain called the temporal lobes, and there's something called a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is part of our limbic system, which is our emotional or more primal brain, if you will. And so the hypothalamus is very much attuned to perceptions, of course, of what you do and about what you do and don't perceive as stressful. And of course, biochemistry is in part an outgrowth of that response. And it's just sort of a general, thing of the, I deal with a lot of amygdala issues, it turns out. But at any rate, the limbic brain. So then we need to look at what are emotions. Well, if you want to know what emotional states are, if we're looking at how it is that we perceive stress and how, what our beliefs are about it, well, emotions are just simply biochemical storms in the body and the brain. And the healthier your biochemistry, of course, the better the emotional and also cognitive forecast. So you need to keep in mind here that we see absolutely everything through this lens that is our blood sugar stability, the degree to which you're dependent on it, and we'll get to that, our hormones and our neurotransmitters. This is how we interpret the entire world around us. We're human beings. We wake up in the morning and you happen to be in a hypoglycemic funk because you've made yourself metabolically dependent on blood sugar for your primary source of fuel. You're going to feel basically like crap. You're going to wake up and you're going to look at the world through that lens, and it's human nature to try to make sense of that, to try to give meaning to that somehow. So you'll be like, well, why do I feel like this? It's because my relationship sucks, or my job sucks, or the world sucks, or whatever. And that is the lens through which you're seeing things. At any given time, we all have a choice of really, and we all have great things happening in our lives and lousy things happening in our lives that we could choose to focus on. Why do we choose to focus on one thing or another? Some of it is habitual patterns. but a lot of it has to do with this lens. So this is a critical piece that gets overlooked, I think. So this mind-body connection thing, yes, the brain is in large measure connected to the body, well, in most people anyway, and I can think of a few exceptions, but I won't name names. So basically, in my humble view, that the idea of the mind-body connection is a total myth. Why? Because there isn't any fundamental separation from mind and body. These are both part of the same functioning or dysfunctioning system that need to be understood together in context. And of course, mental and physical health are unavoidably linked. So, both the brain and body need certain raw materials in order to function. And the hint here, it's not donuts. So without these raw materials, no amount of any therapy of any kind is going to ever have optimal or lasting results. And to quote the wonderful biochemist Candace Pert, our body is our subconscious mind. And anybody who thinks their conscious mind is running the show is seriously mistaken. In fact, the conscious mind may just be the most narcissistic entity in the universe. It thinks it's running the show. It's not. I will tell you that blood sugar issues are extremely pivotal when it comes to mental health issues. They're foundational to the regulation of all endocrine function, and they're extremely important, if not key contributors, to many issues surrounding mental health. And each of these will have the effect of stimulating sympathetic overarousal, which will generate or exacerbate excitatory activity in the brain. And I'm telling you, this is a runaway problem. Blood sugar surges also are enormously destabilizing neurologically, hormonally, behaviorally, and emotionally. It's huge. So the other issue, of course, is that we've got this little thing called advanced glycosylation end products that I talk about in my book, but glucose in the bloodstream basically auto-oxidizes, and this produces potent free radical activity that damages tissues, forming cross-links with these proteins called advanced glycosylation end products, and they're known to accelerate age-associated declines in the functioning of cells, including brain cells and other tissues, causing mutations in DNA, and this leads to deterioration of brain function over time and increased risk for cancers in all of us. I mean, we all have blood sugar, regardless of whether we're a low-carb person or a high-carb person. It's a question of degrees and how rapidly this occurs. So, what are the implications for mental health? Well, these surges of blood sugar are a really common source of depression, anxiety, mania, mood swings, hyperactivity, irritability, violent tendencies, and cognitive and attention-related dysfunction. I see this every day in my clients, and when we apply some of these principles I'll be talking about, I invariably see improvements, sometimes radical improvements in these populations that just has a wonderfully enhancing effect on brain training. And think about it too, if you're dependent on blood sugar for a primary source of fuel and you come in and you're hypoglycemic, your brain's got nothing to work on. So getting that under control, or better yet, eliminating blood sugar from that mood and cognitive equation, in my view, is the way to go. Blood sugar surges also deplete the body of magnesium and also B-complex vitamins, which are essential to normal, healthy, and calm neurological functioning. Addressing these blood sugar issues are essential to mental health and stability. And just touch upon this, glycation is a primary cause of brain degeneration, aging, and also Alzheimer's. So what are the additional consequences of chronic excess carbohydrate consumption? I can tell you from my own experience as a clinician, and I am not alone among my colleagues, that by far the most damaged, intractably damaged brains and nervous systems I have ever encountered have to the letter been vegetarians and especially vegans. These brains and nervous systems sometimes are so severely neurologically damaged that a good deal of it may even be irreversible. It's a very, very difficult thing. These are tough clients to help because you can brain train till the cows come home, but if the brain doesn't have what it needs in order to function well, it's very, very difficult to reach these populations. So here are some of the additional consequences. And again, I see this all the time, every day. Serotonin depletion, magnesium depletion. Nothing is more destabilizing to the brain and nervous system than blood sugar surges and food sensitivity reactions. I will add to that. And nothing is more stabilizing to the brain than natural dietary fat. Nothing. And we're going to touch on something called gluten here. It's a very big issue, and it's a much bigger issue, I think, than anybody realizes. Wherever neurological or cognitive, attentional, or mood-based issues present, gluten sensitivity and or celiac disease should always be included as a suspect. So in an article in the journal Neurology states that gluten sensitivity can be primarily and at times exclusively a neurological disease, affecting not only the brain and nervous system directly, but also cognitive and psychiatric illness. So everybody thinks of it as a gut issue. By the way, 7 or 8 out of 10 celiac sufferers actually have no gastrointestinal symptoms. Okay, more than a word. In the Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Psychiatry, the article states that, quote, our finding implies that immune response triggered by sensitivity to gluten may find expression in organs other than the gut, and the peripheral and central nervous systems are particularly susceptible. More to consider. Study published in 2009 in the peer-reviewed journal Gastroenterology compared 10,000 available blood samples from individuals 50 years ago to 10,000 people today and found that there has been a 400% increase in the incidence of full-blown celiac disease, which is a bit of a redundant statement, and I'll get to that in a second, because the only way celiac disease actually gets diagnosed, this is the standard of diagnosis. You know, inside the small intestine, we have these microvilli that look like shag carpeting lining the inside of the small intestine. These little villi and microvilli are where we absorb our nutrients. It's all the extra surface area that allow us to absorb the food that we eat. And in the process of celiac disease, what occurs is that this shag carpeting eventually kind of erodes away and basically becomes Berber, right? You are not diagnosable with celiac disease until this has become this. If you go and you get a biopsy and it looks like this, you're fine, go home, have some bread. You are not diagnosable until total damage has occurred. And this is the standard of diagnosis. So if you've been told you don't have it, I don't know. I'm not saying that you do, but I'm saying that that's open to question. So ponder this. Really only and by the way, celiac is the #1 most common autoimmune disease on the planet today, and only an estimated 1% of all suffering gluten sensitivity or celiac disease is ever diagnosed. Maybe a few people in this room. And also this, food sensitivity reactions will impact blood sugar and insulin, even on a very low carbohydrate diet. And I'm not talking about, just, eating the occasional, bit of grain or whatever. I'm talking about even trace exposure is enough to unravel you. And that's something that's not well understood at all. So why pick on poor gluten? There's so many other food sensitivities to be had. Well, gluten can be looked upon, I think, somewhat as a bit of a gateway food sensitivity. It's known to increase an enzyme in the body known as zonulin, sort of unique among, food sensitivities. And this controls intestinal permeability. So we have these tight junctures in our small intestine that really are very selective in their willingness to allow things to get through into your bloodstream. When you consume gluten and you produce this enzyme in response to that called zonulin, which is produced in also response to other things like the polysaccharides, the junctures do this. And now, basically, elevated zonulin levels in the presence of gluten will allow anything to get through. And in time, this can start triggering other immunologic reactions to other foods. So, virtually anything can get through. The immune system starts recognizing undigested, partially digested peptides and begins mounting an immune response. And eventually you could be reacting to anything. You could react to everything eventually. Now, casein is very similar in its molecular structure to gluten. Very, very, very similar. It's one of the most common co-sensitivities with gluten. But again, the immune system can come to react to almost anything if gluten consumption persists. And this, of course, can be a very real problem. Once the multiple, food sensitivities and multiple chemical sensitivity and everything start taking over, you start this vicious cycle that just really only worsens in time and becomes very difficult to correct. And this is a miserable thing to live with at best. And again, I see this all the time. It is a very interesting, and it is surmountable, but there's so much misunderstanding about this that, it takes a bit of an education, and then it takes some, systematic and hard work to get past it. So here's something to be keeping in mind here. Being mostly gluten-free is like saying, I'm just a little bit pregnant. You either are or you're not. And only total and permanent abstinence from gluten, even in trace amounts, can lead to restored health in a person that is gluten sensitive. And again, all celiac disease is gluten sensitivity, but not all gluten sensitivity is celiac disease. Gluten sensitivity encompasses a wider spectrum, and that needs to be appreciated because it's also autoimmune in nature. Anxiety-related disorders, which, by the way, are currently absolutely epidemic. I would say I see probably more anxiety-related issues per capita than any other thing, and maybe everything else combined, although so many things are within that sort of spectrum. And again, I look at these things within a spectrum, or significant numbers of people with bipolar presenting with serotonin antibodies. So, and people with Parkinson's showing up with dopamine antibodies, and also, people with depression with serotonin antibodies. So these kinds of things are extremely common. Chronic pain, PTSD, and certain forms, of course, of insomnia. So what are the nutritional considerations? Well, again, carbs and blood sugar regulation, we have to start there. And, protein and amino acids, are you getting sufficient protein? And is that protein being sufficiently digested into its component amino acids so that you can make the neurotransmitters that then produce things like serotonin and GABA and, whatever else that you need in order to, regulate, your nervous system. Again, digestion is huge. I mean, we can be eating the best quality paleo diet that there is on the planet, and if you can't digest it, then, at best you're not doing yourself very much good, and at worst you may even be doing yourself some harm. So digestive issues, and particularly if you're coming from a vegetarian or vegan diet, these are issues that really need to be intelligently addressed, I think, in order for recovery to be something that is going to be reliable. Food sensitivity issues, huge, huge, huge with anxiety-related issues. Dehydration, sometimes it's just that simple. Just the need to drink, enough water. Anemia, wow, iron, B6 or B12 anemia, all three can have a tremendous impact on anxiety. And one of the reasons for this is that part of the brain that is often overheated, so to speak, in anxiety-riddled individuals are the basal ganglia, again, part of the limbic system. And the basal ganglia are very, very oxygen dependent. And of course, if you're anemic, you are not, you don't have enough hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is not carrying oxygen to some of these critical parts of the brain, and so these parts of the brain become disinhibited. And if I have an anxious person, I do a lot of functional blood chemistry analysis in my office. I differentiate that from the type of blood chemistry analysis you get at your doctor's office. I'm really just sort of looking for imbalances in things and comparing people to normative values. In other words, people that are normal and healthy instead of the lab ranges, which basically aren't based on anything scientific, based upon a population deemed to be, and we'll throw quotes around it, normal and healthy. In other words, not having any symptoms right now, not on any medications. And these ranges are instead, they're much narrower. But you have much, much fewer people falling through the cracks with this. It's a much more meaningful range to a person who just wants to know, how do I compare to normal and healthy? And if you're outside of that functional range, it doesn't mean you have pathology. We're just looking at, there's an area of imbalance. And so, anyway, this is something that I look at routinely. Minerals like magnesium, iron, iodine, and zinc are also critical to these issues. I also look at what kinds of things people are self-medicating with, cravings. Sometimes people, they have tons of chocolate cravings. Sometimes that can be an indication for a need for magnesium. And dietary fat intake. The low-fat diets or EFA deficiencies and fat-soluble nutrient deficiencies like vitamin D and whatnot, and vitamin A, also can be contributory to these conditions. Helps to modulate cortisol, which is a stress hormone level in the brain, needed for proper memory and cognitive functioning. And also note, arachidonic acid, GLA saturates, and other fats and cholesterol also have important roles to play in cognitive functioning. It's not all omega-3s, folks. I mean, there are other things happening in the brain, too. And statin drugs, again, by lowering cholesterol in the body and brain, can also result in memory issues and dementia-like symptoms in some individuals. In fact, that's one of the side effects listed on the packaging. Excessively low cholesterol is also known to impact mood and cognitive performance. So, of course, no diet will remove all the fat from your body because the brain is entirely fat. Without a brain, you might look good, but all you could do is run for public office. George Bernard Shaw. So depression. I come into the field of neurofeedback because I suffered from depression for about 35 years of my life before I stumbled across neurofeedback. And so this is an area near and dear and very close to my heart. Neurofeedback really did a tremendous amount to liberate me from that, and it's been a non-issue now in the last 15 years. I'm very happy to say. But major depression alone is expected to be the second leading cause of disability by 2020 worldwide, second to only ischemic heart disease. And in just the United States, the lifetime risk for major depression is nearly a quarter of the population. Depression, again, may be viewed in many cases as the flip side to the anxiety coin. You see them together all the time. And it's very misunderstood. It's a state. Most people think you're depressed. You need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get moving and get some exercise and try to feel better. And really, what people don't realize, you're spinning your wheels. When I think of the amount of energy that it took me to get through a single day when I was depressed, I mean, it was a state of chronic efforting. I exhausted myself every day. So oftentimes, what I see nowadays is a state in depression of anxiety to exhaustion in people. And oftentimes, it can be responsive, from my experience, by addressing things from the standpoint of anxiety. So other issues to consider. Diet in general, of course, are issues to consider with respect to this. Blood sugar, adrenal health. Got to whip through some of these. Thyroid, another thing. Anemia, again. Certain food deficiency or nutrient deficiencies. Food sensitivities, again, and possible autoimmune processes. Seasonal affective disorder. Digestive issues. Sleep disorders. Life issues, circumstances, history of trauma, of course, you have to consider. But a depressed brain, of course, you can see is oftentimes characterized by severe hypoperfusion. And by the way, one of the things that is characteristic of a gluten sensitivity reaction is hypoperfusion to the brain, and particularly the frontal cortex. I'm just saying. Nutritional considerations, blood sugar issues, again. And again, it can lead to serotonin depletion. Yes, serotonin tends to be released when you eat something carbohydrate-based, but it doesn't give you anything to make more. And when you're chronically eating carbohydrates as a way of elevating your mood, you're fundamentally depleting your brain of that very neurotransmitter. Gluten sensitivity leads, again, to frontal lobe hypoperfusion and chronic microglial activation. That's your brain's immune system. Those inflammatory states, your brain doesn't have the brakes that the rest of the immune system in your body on the other side of the blood-brain barrier does. And so these inflammatory responses can persist in the brain, often for months, 6 months or more, in people that have this sort of thing chronically activated. Sufficient complete source protein intake. Again, vegetarian, vegan diets are very high carb diets, can lead to diminished hydrochloric acid production and insufficient amino acids for the neurotransmitter synthesis. Essentially, excessively low-fat intake leading to EFA deficiencies, impaired neurological function, and absorption and utilization of fat-soluble nutrients. Huge. Mineral deficiencies such as zinc, magnesium, iron, which are normally essential for positive mood. Something that I see a ton of. Blood sugar dysregulation, again, food sensitivities, especially gluten, digestive disorders, heavy metal toxicity, anemia, diagnosed or undiagnosed thyroid issues. And so many of these things can tie in with food, including the heavy metal toxicities. Blood sugar issues, number one most powerfully influencing factor, followed by gluten sensitivities, very close second. Insulin and leptin dysregulation are both generated by chronic blood sugar surges, and both stimulate sympathetic overarousal. And chronic blood sugar dysregulation leads to excess cortisol and adrenaline production, metabolic syndrome, and increased potential for food sensitivities. So again, chronic blood sugar surges will cause magnesium loss, and magnesium is, of course, necessary for normal parasympathetic functioning. This is huge. And insulin, of course, is needed to store intracellular magnesium, and magnesium is needed to produce and utilize insulin. Insulin resistance is depleting of and prevents retention of magnesium. And again, note, magnesium loss also results in elevated histamine levels. A lot of times, during certain times of the year when things are blooming or whatever, sometimes you see kind of kids starting to get hyperactive again or agitated, And I start asking, does your kid have seasonal allergies? Oh, yeah. Well, histamine basically functions as an excitatory neurotransmitter. And depressed magnesium actually elevates histamine even more. Excess carbs also lead to an increased demand for B complex, especially B1, B6, and may readily lead to deficiencies. High carb diets tend to be poor protein utilization diets. High carbohydrate consumption can lead, of course, to yeast overgrowth, which has its own vector for anxiety-related issues, sleep disturbances, hypoglycemia and reactive hypoglycemia, big time, and premature aging. So, our hero of the day, dietary fat and mental health. So what are the roles of fat in mental health? Well, fats make up 60 to 80% by dry weight of the brain. And about half of this, by the way, is saturated fat. In fact, why do you suppose that so much of the fat in our body is saturated? I'll give you a hint. We're not refrigerated. I mean, with all this talk that's given to antioxidants, people forget that saturated fat by its very nature is inherently resistant to oxidation. And your body uses it to actually protect those delicate polyunsaturated fats and also help your body better utilize them. The lining of our lungs is made up of a disaturate molecule. We want that because that's what's protective of the lungs against oxidative onslaught. Now, about 11% of the brain is arachidonic acid, E below arachidonic acid, and about 25% of the fatty acids in the brain, the essential fatty acids, are DHA, which of course is that elongated and state omega-3. And by the way, the note, and Craig Stanford, I'm sure, could address this too, the dominant essential fatty acid in the non-human primate brain is an omega-6. So we're not monkeys. Some people maybe. Anyway, the richest concentration of cholesterol in the human body is in the human brain. 25% of the body's repository of cholesterol is in the brain. And we need it for normal neurological, cognitive, and mood functioning. I'm telling you, some of the people that I see on statin drugs, one of their common complaints is, I can't remember things, I get confused, it's seriously problematic. Fats are essential to the absorption of certain nutrients. Fats and cholesterol are essential for the formation of certain hormones. Fats and cholesterol are essential for the structure and healthy functioning of our cell membranes. Fats and cholesterol are essential for a healthy and stable nervous system. Making sure you're eating a nutrient-dense diet is a means of taking the best and oldest tried and true diet. If it's a fad diet, folks, it's the oldest diet known to humankind. Optimizing it for health and longevity. And also being able to afford it. I'm telling you, you will save hundreds of dollars a month. And mental and physical health, again, are inextricably entwined. We see the world through this lens that is our blood sugar stability, our instability, our hormones, and our neurotransmitters, and these will, to a significant degree, color our perception and experience of the world. So there's nothing more stabilizing to the brain than healthy natural dietary fat, nothing more destabilizing than dietary sugar and starch. The more you can come to rely on ketones as your brain's primary source of fuel, the healthier and more stable your brain will be, and the more gracefully it will age. Efficient and natural dietary fat adds a longevity and vitality bonus to both physical and cognitive function. And that ain't no monkey business.
That's a really nice place to be lucid and still present and but still in that space. This is a good place to work through trauma. So the cool thing about working with Amrita and trauma work is that PTSD is this reoccurring stimulus response cycle. And so let's say something happened to you when you were younger and a memory is triggered by a stimulus in the present moment that reminds you of that experience. And then the body says, oh no, that's a negative experience. And the fight or flight response is activated. So with Omnium muscaria being a GABA agonist, it actually is suppressing that fight or flight response, which, it's important to have this. This is how we survived as people for millions of years. But in this modern day and age, it's oftentimes overactivated. Our stress response is overactivated. So whenever we have this stimulus response cycle actually paused for a moment, you're actually not participating in that feedback loop anymore. And whenever you do this, you can actually have a new response to that memory, and it's actually helps you get to a place where you're not that traumatized person anymore because you're rewriting the script. So that's a really nice place to work at with the threshold dose. And this is something that you would want to have, like, you know, it's me time. I'm gonna, you know, end my day. I'm gonna spend the next, 4 hours or so before I go to bed to enjoy this experience.